Hey everybody, this video is going to go over what goes into an APA reference entry for a source. So be sure to like and subscribe below to keep these videos coming. So we're going to start with the APA Styles homepage that reviews the basic principles of what goes into a reference entry. There are 4 elements that go into a reference entry. The first one is the author, after that is the date, the next thing is the title, and the last part is the source. Source is basically, where did I get this information? So where did I, as a writer, find it, and how is my instructor or reader going to find it as well? So one of the things that you can use as a resource, over here on the right-hand side of this screen, you can see these related handouts from APA. These are handouts that I give my students. The last one is the Scaffolded Reference Elements Worksheet. This is one that I highly recommend printing out and using as you are building your reference entries. So that's what we're going to look at today. So the first part, it breaks down each of those elements. So the first element is, of course, the author. So APA does the author last name, comma, first initial. Now, if you have a first name and a middle name, then you would use a first initial and a middle initial. And it gives you a couple of examples. A singular author is just the last name, comma, first initial, and it might be first initial, period, space, second initial, period. Just know that if you have both names, you give both initials. And then that period would end your author element, and you would move on to the date element. If you have 2, you do the first one like that. You use the ampersand, which is shift 7. And then you do the second one, and unlike MLA, you write this second author exactly the same way that you did the first. So it's still last name, comma, first initial, or first initial space, middle initial, period. If you have more than 2 authors, APA says that you can list up to 21 authors in a reference entry. If you have more than 21, then you stop at number 20, or you stop at 19, you put an ellipses, 3 dots, and then the last person's name. But otherwise, you have to list every single person who is identified as an author. So when you do those, what you will see is a lot of periods and a lot of commas, and that is totally normal when you are writing the authors for APA reference entries. They give you a couple of examples. Another issue is if you don't have an author, but you have a named editor, you can do the editor like the author. So you would do last name, comma, first initial, period, and then possibly space, middle initial, period. But then you would put in parentheses, ed, period. And then that notes that this is an editor, not an author. And you would put a period at the end of the parentheses to note the end of the author element as a whole. So that is just in case your source doesn't identify an author, but does identify an editor. If you have a TV show, for example, you might not have, obviously, an author, but you would have a director and writers. The director goes first with the parentheses that identifies him or her as the director. Then you would do the writers after that, and it would be the first one with writer in parentheses, and then any additional ones as well. Always make sure that you use a period at the end of each of the 4 elements. So author, date, title, author, date, title, and then source. The only issue is if in the source part, if a link is the last part, then you don't put a period at the end of that because it might mess up the link. Now, if you don't have an individual author, you may have a username. For example, if you are citing YouTube videos, or if you are citing TED Talks, or if you are citing tweets or things like that, you might use a username instead of an author. So you would do the username and then brackets. So that is right next to the P on the keyboard, right to the right-hand side of the P. It's the lowercase, so don't use the shift. It's the square parentheses. Those are called brackets. In brackets, you would put the username that goes with the author's name there. Also, if you do not have an individual author, but you have a group or corporate author, those can be used in the author space. The ones I see most common are probably the Mayo Clinic or Johns Hopkins. Those are the ones I see most commonly used. Merriam-Webster, World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, those are all considered corporate authors. So if the individual page does not identify an individual person to use as the author, then you would use that organization or group as the author instead. Just know that once you use that group name in your citation, you cannot use it again later somewhere else in the citation. It can only be mentioned once. So if you use Mayo Clinic as the corporate author, you would not then again list them in the source area. Just something to keep in mind. The next element is the date. If you are citing a journal article or a book, you only need to use the year. The year goes in parentheses, and then again, you use a period to mark the end of the element. So the period goes outside the parentheses. If you are talking about something that is published, for example, online with a more specific date, things that are published on a regular basis, then you would do the year, comma, spell out the month, and then give the day if it's given. If it's just, the month and the year, you do year, comma, and spell out the month. Again, it's in parentheses, and then there's a period at the end of that. If you are citing something that does not give you a date at all, then you can't just skip this. Like in MLA, if an element was missing, you would just skip it. APA says you cannot skip a date. So you would have to put parentheses still, and you put N period, D period. That stands for no date. Put that in parentheses and put your period after that. Okay. Next thing is the title. All right. So titles of works that stand alone. So these are books, reports like congressional reports, film titles, social media posts, and an entire web page. These are written in italics. These are the only things that are written in italics. These are given what is called sentence casing, which means the first word is capitalized. Any proper nouns, so names of people and places, those are capitalized. And you would capitalize the first word after a colon, exclamation mark, question mark, or period inside the title. So the next word would get capitalized. Otherwise, nothing else in the title is capitalized. That is very different from MLA, that capitalizes all of the content words in a title. So APA doesn't do that. So just kind of keep that in mind. Standalone works get italics if it is the title of a journal article, a newspaper article, a magazine article. Those are not published standalone, so they do not get italics. So that is considered a work that is part of a greater whole. So that means that a journal article doesn't stand alone. It is part of a journal, like a volume or an issue number. If you are citing a journal article, magazine article, book chapter, a specific TV episode, then you would use the same sentence capitalization, but it does not get italics, because you're actually saving the italics for what comes next. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Once you have your title written, then you would put a period at the end to mark the end of this element. Now, note that if you are citing a TV episode, for example, you would put the title of the episode and then in parentheses the identifying information. So this would be the season and the number, comma, and then the episode and number. And then you close the parentheses. Then you need to tell what is that. So for example, if this is a TV series, then you would put brackets, TV series episode. And we'll look at how to cite YouTube videos later, since that kind of is more common. I see that more in students' essays. But it works kind of the same way. You have to identify what it is. So where is it? So season 4, episode 5, and then what is it? So TV series episode. So parentheses first, bracket second, period at the end to note the end of the element. After the title is the source. Now this gets a little bit more in depth. So works that stand alone, basically you are looking at the publisher, database or archive that you found it in if it is appropriate, like if it is a closed database, a social media site or a website. Ideally you want to use DOIs if at all possible, because that is a digital object identifier. It is a permanent link to that source. If you do not have that, however, you could use a URL. They give you a couple of examples of publishers, Instagram, and then a link as an example. Works that are part of a greater whole. This is the majority of what I see from students. So this is a journal article, for example, or a book chapter or a TV episode. The first thing that you would want to do for a journal article is give the journal title, then you need volume and issue and page numbers, and then a DOI if possible. If not, you could use a URL. They give you a couple of examples over here. You might also have, for example, in this particular edited book, it tells you the editors first. It gives you parentheses noting that EDS period, those are the editors. The title of the book, again, only the first word, content words, and words after specific punctuation are capitalized. Page numbers, because this is a specific chapter in a book, so you put parentheses, PP period, and the page numbers for that chapter. Then the database that you use to find it, and the DOI. So that would be for a book chapter, for example. Periodicals, these are things that are published periodically, so on occasion. So again, these are your journal articles. These might also be newspaper articles or magazine articles. So if you're getting something from The Atlantic or from Forbes, this is kind of what you're looking at. You've got your title of the source material, so that would be your journal title, newspaper name, magazine name, something like that is in italics. Volume number is also in italics. Issue numbers get in parentheses, but they are not in italics, and there's not a space between your volume and issue. Then a comma, and then page numbers. After the page numbers, you put a period and then your link, preferably a DOI. Always go with that if you have one. Use a URL if you do not. Books and reports. You would use the publisher information. If there's more than one publisher, you list all of them in the order shown, separated by semicolons. If the author and the publisher are same, so like Mayo Clinic, then that person or that group is in the author position and is not mentioned again here. So if you have World Health Organization over here as the author, you do not put it over here again as the publisher. One or the other, but not both. Then, of course, you would give your link at the very end, and with your DOIs or your URLs. Edited book chapters, again, you do the editors first, then the title of the book, page numbers, publisher, link. Web pages, you provide the website name in title case, but not italics. So if you have an author who is identified and they're in the author spot, but now you want to put the publisher in here. So the Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Control, do not use acronyms here. Spell it out. So if you have the World Health Organization, you have to write that out. You can't write WHO. If you have NASA, you got to spell out the whole thing. And then you would put your link at the very end. For most cases, you do not need a retrieval date. The only time you need a retrieval date is if you are citing something that is likely to change on a very regular and frequent basis. For example, if you are citing today's forecast, that is going to change. You would put a retrieval date. If you are citing today's COVID statistics, that's going to change regularly, frequently, so you would put a retrieval date in a case like that. And that would be the end of this particular document. I think it is good to use. There are examples that you can use at the bottom of this document that you can use as models for when you are building your own. So I highly recommend going to the APA website and finding their handout called Scaffolded Reference Elements Worksheet. I hope that this helps. Good luck on your project and have a great day.